Today we're going to learn about Election 2000. It was one of the most exciting and interesting elections in recent history. Before we begin, everyone should have their electoral map and a red pencil and a blue pencil. We are going to watch the returns come in. We're going to see which direction each state went, whether they went Democrat or Republican. As we do so, we're going to color in the states to match the map on the screen. But there's one rule. You cannot color Florida. I'm going to repeat that. Do not color Florida. If everyone is ready now, we will close the polls on the East Coast. And the polls are closed on the East Coast. At this point, the Democrats went wild. They were so excited. They thought that they had won Florida, and Florida has 25 electoral votes. That makes it one of the most important states to win in this election. The Republicans were also excited that they'd won Ohio. They weren't sure if they were going to, and the Democrats were excited about Pennsylvania. So the Republicans had something to celebrate, but the Democrats were pretty sure that they were going to win. So we'll take a few seconds for you to quickly color in your electoral maps. Remember, you're not coloring in Florida. Let's take about 15 more seconds to finish coloring. All right, you should be finishing up coloring your map because the polls are about to close in the Central Time Zone. And the polls are closed in the Central Time Zone. Now at this point, you might notice that the map looks way more red. Does that mean that the Republicans are definitely winning? No, of course it doesn't, because we know that even if there is more area with red, it's the numbers that are important. If you win all the big states that each only have 3 electoral votes, does that mean you're actually going to win the election? No, you need to make sure you win the states that have the most electoral votes, the most populous states with the most people. So this section of the map in the middle here, it's mostly red, but everyone knew that it was going to be mostly red. North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas pretty much always go Republican these days. There was a little excitement about which way Wisconsin was going to go, and Wisconsin went to the Democrats. So they're actually pretty excited about this section of the returns, even though it does look, if you just glance at it, like it is mostly going to the Republicans who are red. But we know that just because the map looks more one color, it doesn't mean that that side is winning. All right, so you're going to color in this section of your map. We'll take about 20 seconds to do that. All right, finish up coloring your map because the polls are about to close in the Mountain Time Zone. And the polls are closed in the Mountain Time Zone. You'll see here the map got even more red. People weren't quite sure which direction New Mexico was going to go, so once again the Democrats are excited about that, but all the rest of the Mountain Time Zone went to the Republicans, as people kind of thought it was going to. So this shouldn't take you very long to color. Let's take about 20 seconds to finish coloring up the Mountain Time Zone. All right, you should be finishing coloring in all of these great big but pretty empty states, and we're getting ready to close the polls on the West Coast. Now, I want you to think for a moment before we close the polls in the Pacific time zone, which way do you think they're going to go? Do you think we're going to see more Republican returns in California and Oregon and Washington and Nevada, or do you think we're going to see more Democrats? Think about it with your brains for a second. All right, let's see who's right, and we'll close the polls on the Pacific time zone. And the polls are closed in the Pacific time zone. And you can see here that California, Oregon, and Washington all went Democratic, and Nevada stayed Republican. Is that what you thought was going to happen? Yeah, this was pretty much what everyone expected to happen. California usually goes Democrat these days. And you can see that it actually had 54 electoral votes back in 2000. How many does it have now? Yeah, it's got 55 now, so there's been some changes. But California is still the most important, biggest state. So the Democrats are still pretty excited. Ooh, but look at that. Did you notice what happened to Florida? Up until this point, Florida had been marked as going to the Democrats. It had been marked blue. But now it's red. That's not a mistake. At that time, the Florida election was so close that we couldn't really call it. The people who were trying to figure out who was going to win Florida, they kept going back and forth, thinking it was going to be the Democrats, and then thinking, no, wait, it was the Republicans. And at this point, they flipped it over to the Republicans, and the Democrats were just devastated. At this point, Al Gore, who was running for the Democratic nominee, he actually called up George Bush, who was running as the Republican nominee, and said, well, it looks like you're going to win. Congratulations. I hope you do a good job. And he got in his car, and Al Gore was ready to go give a speech to all of his supporters saying, thank you so much for supporting me. Better luck next time. We'll try to support the current president, because that's what you do when you lose. So the Democrats were so sad. Gore was just completely ready to give up. He thought that he had lost. But then Florida was too close to call. You see how on this map, Florida is white, not red or blue? At this point, when they were counting all of the votes, they couldn't figure out who had won Florida. It was too close. So they decided to ask for a recount. Al Gore actually called George Bush back and said, oh, never mind. We're actually going to recount the votes. So I'm not going to concede. I'm not going to give a speech saying I give up. And everyone went to bed that night, and then when they woke up in the morning, we still didn't know who our president was, because Florida still wasn't decided. They were still counting. When the Democrats asked for a recount in Florida, the campaigns, both the Democrat and Republican campaigns, flew and drove down all of their workers and volunteers to Florida. There were tons and tons of people coming to Florida to count all the ballots. In Florida, the way they voted in 2000 is they had a little punch card. You had to punch a hole through a card to pick which candidate you wanted. There was a little punch hole next to the name Gore and a little punch hole next to the name Bush, and you punch through. When you guys are punching holes in papers, like to go in your binder, have you ever punched and the punch doesn't go all the way through, so there's a little flap of paper still sitting there in the hole of your notebook paper? Well, that happened sometime in Florida, and occasionally there'd be a little piece of paper, they called it a hanging chad, hanging in the ballot. And so they'd have to have one Republican and one Democrat look at each ballot and just try to decide together who they thought the person was trying to vote for. It took forever. There are pictures out there you can look up of like 10 people all staring at one little vote to try to figure out if it went for Gore or for Bush. It took weeks and weeks and weeks of recounting and recounting and recounting. Eventually, the Supreme Court stepped in and said, you have to stop counting now. You have to just stop, and whoever is ahead now wins. Some people thought that this wasn't very fair because the decision on the Supreme Court, there are 9 people on the Supreme Court. 5 of them were Republicans and 4 of them were Democrats. And the 5 Republicans made the people in Florida stop counting ballots when the Republican nominee, Bush, was ahead, and the 4 Democrats disagreed. But since 5 is bigger than 4, they still had to stop. Lots of people are still angry about this decision because they think it was too political, and the Supreme Court was just deciding based on what their team was, what their political party was, which is not what they're supposed to do. So they did stop counting and tried to and when Bush was ahead. Now, do you think people would care very much about this election, about where Florida went, if someone already had 270 electoral votes? Remember, you need 270 electoral votes to win the presidency. If someone already had 270, even without Florida, do you think that they would care which way Florida went? I mean, they'd want to make sure they figured it out eventually, but it probably wouldn't have been that big of a deal. Let's take a look at where the electoral votes were without Florida. Here are the electoral votes without Florida. Bush has 246 and Gore has 266. Do either of them have 270? No. You're very good at math. That's right. Neither of them have 270. Let's see what would happen if we added in Florida. If we add Florida's 25 electoral votes to Bush's 246 and Gore's 266, oh no! We see that whoever wins Florida would get at least 270 votes. Bush would get 271 and Gore would get 291. So you can see how Florida is absolutely essential to winning this election in 2000. Now remember the other day we discussed how some people don't think that the winner-takes-all electoral system is fair? What would happen if instead of Bush, if he won by just 1 or 2 votes, getting all 25 electors, what if he only got 13 and Gore got the other 12? Would Bush have enough to get all the way to 270? No, he wouldn't, but Gore would. So in that way, if Florida was like those other 2 states, Nebraska and Maine, who split up their electoral votes, that could have completely changed this election. It makes a lot of sense that some people complain that the winner-takes-all system isn't really very fair. So after weeks and weeks of recounts in Florida, and the Supreme Court finally stepping in and saying in a 5-4 decision that the counting had to stop and the vote had to go to whoever was winning at that time, Bush won by 286 votes. Not 286,000 votes, 286 votes. That's the number of people, give or take, who are in your D lunch. That's half of the 8th grade at Kilmer. That's nothing. Millions and millions of people voted in Florida, and only 286 were the deciding votes between Bush and Gore. Could we say that every vote counts? Yeah, every vote definitely counted in Florida in 2000. Now let's take a look at the popular vote. You'll remember that the popular vote is if we just counted up everyone who voted in America and we saw who voted for Bush and who voted for Gore and whoever got the most won. Remember, that's how we thought that maybe elections worked until we learned about the Electoral College. Let's see what the popular vote was in the 2000 election. All right, so here's the popular vote. We can see that Bush, the Republican, whose states were red, he won 50,456,062 votes. That means that 50,456,062 people voted for Bush in the whole country. And we can see that Gore, the Democrat in blue, he got 50,996,582 people to vote for him. Wait a minute, what's going on here? We know that Bush won the election, right? Bush won Florida. He got 270. And he won. He got 270 electoral votes, and Gore only got 266 electoral votes. But who got more of the popular vote? Did more people vote for Bush, or did more people vote for Gore? This is the only election so far where this has happened. Gore actually won the popular vote. More people voted for Gore. About 500,000 more people voted for Gore than voted for Bush. This is the only time in our nation's history that someone won the popular vote but lost the electoral vote. And this is the reason that a lot of people complain about the Electoral College. Interestingly, a lot of Democrats complain about the Electoral College, and a lot of Republicans say that it's a great idea. And I don't know if either of those groups are being honest, but I think it's interesting to note that the people who won the 2000 election like the Electoral College, and the people who lost the 2000 election do not like the Electoral College. So after all that counting in Florida and all that trouble trying to figure out who had won Florida, eventually Florida went to Bush. So now your map should look like this, and now you can finally color in Florida. If you haven't been able to finish coloring your map, you should finish coloring it now, and then you should paste it as the next page into your notebook and add it to your table of contents. I'll see you tomorrow.